Stop scrolling right now. I'm about to tell you the name of the man who killed Jesus Christ. Not just watched him die, not just stood guard. The man who personally drove a spear through the Son of God's heart and ended his earthly life. His name was Longinus. And what happened to this hardened Roman killer in the 3 hours after he murdered the Messiah will absolutely blow your mind. Because this man went from being Jesus's executioner to Jesus's evangelist in a single afternoon. From a man who pierced Christ's side to the man who proclaimed Christ's divinity. But here's what's going to shock you even more. The Roman Empire tried to erase this story from history. The religious leaders wanted it buried. Even some early Christians were uncomfortable with it. Why? Because it proves that no one, and I mean no-one, is beyond the reach of God's grace. Longinus had blood on his hands. Literally, the blood of hundreds of crucifixion victims. The blood of rebels, thieves, and innocent men. And finally, the blood of the Son of God himself. Yet what God did with this man's life after that moment will forever change how you see your own failures, your own past, your own potential for redemption. By the time we're done today, you'll understand why this story was so dangerous that Rome tried to silence it, why it was so powerful that it converted an entire garrison of soldiers, and why it's so relevant that it might just transform your life the same way it transformed his. So buckle up, because we're about to witness the most dramatic inversion in human history. The story of the man who killed Jesus and lived to tell about it. Let me paint you a picture of who Longinus really was before he ever laid eyes on Jesus of Nazareth. Gaius Cassius Longinus, his full name, wasn't some rookie soldier given crucifixion duty as punishment. He was a centurion, which meant he commanded 100 men. He was experienced, respected, and absolutely ruthless. In the Roman military, you didn't rise to centurion rank by showing mercy. You got there by being efficient, obedient, and deadly. By the time he met Jesus, Longinus had probably overseen hundreds of crucifixions. Think about that. Hundreds. Men, women, sometimes entire families nailed to wooden beams and left to die slowly in the scorching Middle Eastern sun. It was his job, his specialty, his legacy written in blood and screams. The Romans had turned execution into an art form, and crucifixion was their masterpiece of torture. It wasn't designed to kill quickly. It was designed to kill slowly, publicly, and with maximum humiliation. The victim would hang for hours, sometimes days, gasping for air, their body weight pulling against the nails, their muscles cramping in agony. And Longinus had watched it all, time after time after time. He'd heard the cries for mercy, the pleas for water, the final gasps of breath. He'd seen strong men reduced to whimpering children. He'd watched rebels curse Rome with their last breath, and cowards beg for forgiveness that never came. But here's what made Longinus particularly effective at his job. He felt nothing. Years of violence had hardened his heart like steel. Death was just administrative paperwork to him. Pain was just part of the process. Human suffering was just. Tuesday, the Gospels tell us that Roman soldiers cast lots for Jesus' clothing while he hung dying above them. Can you imagine that level of callousness? A man is being tortured to death 3 feet above your head, and you're gambling for his possessions. That's the kind of man Longinus was. Cold, calculating, completely desensitized to human suffering. He'd risen through the ranks by following orders without question. Kill this rebel? Done. Crucify this terrorist? No problem. Execute this Jewish prophet who's been causing trouble? Just another day at the office. But there was something else about Longinus that made him perfect for God's plan, though he didn't know it yet. He was a truth teller. Roman centurions were trained to observe, assess, and report accurately. Their lives depended on reading situations correctly and responding appropriately. They couldn't afford to be sentimental or delusional. This matters because when Longinus finally spoke at the foot of the cross, his words carried weight. He wasn't some emotional follower caught up in religious hysteria. He was a trained military observer giving his professional assessment of what he'd witnessed. And what he witnessed that day would haunt him, change him, and ultimately save him. But none of that had happened yet. On the morning of what we now call Good Friday, Longinus was just another Roman killing machine, preparing for just another execution. He had no idea he was about to meet the one man who could break through decades of hardened brutality and reach his stone-cold heart. He had no idea that by sunset, he would be on his knees, proclaiming the divinity of the very man he'd just killed. The morning started like any other execution day. Longinus received his orders from Pontius Pilate. Oversee the crucifixion of 3 criminals. 2 were common thieves, routine work. But the third was different. This one had the religious leaders of Jerusalem worked up into a frenzy. Jesus of Nazareth, the so-called king of the Jews. Now, Longinus had heard the rumors. This Jesus had been stirring up trouble throughout Galilee and Judea for 3 years. Some said he performed miracles. Others said he claimed to be the Son of God. The religious establishment said he was a dangerous heretic who needed to be silenced permanently. But Longinus didn't care about Jewish religious disputes. Politics and theology were above his pay grade. His job was simple: make sure all 3 men died before sunset, as Jewish law required. Clean, efficient, professional. What he couldn't have known was that he was walking into the most spiritually charged moment in human history. The forces of heaven and hell were about to collide, and he was going to be standing at ground zero. The first sign that this wasn't going to be a routine execution came during the trial. Longinus had observed hundreds of condemned prisoners. He knew how they acted. Some begged, some cursed, some broke down completely, some maintained sullen defiance. But Jesus was different. He carried himself with a dignity that was almost regal. When Pilate asked him questions, Jesus answered with calm authority. When the crowd screamed for his death, Jesus looked at them with something that looked disturbingly like compassion. And when the Roman soldiers mocked him, placing a crown of thorns on his head and purple robe on his shoulders, calling him King of the Jews, there was something in Jesus' eyes that made even these hardened veterans uncomfortable. He wasn't angry. He wasn't afraid. He was sorrowful, like he felt sorry for them. Longinus had never seen anything like it. In his experience, innocent men protested their innocence loudly. Guilty men either confessed or lied desperately. But this man seemed to be carrying the weight of some cosmic burden that went far beyond his immediate circumstances. Still, orders were orders. Longinus supervised the brutal flogging, 39 lashes with a leather whip embedded with metal and bone fragments. He watched Jesus' back turn into hamburger meat. He saw the blood pool at his feet. And through it all, Jesus never cursed his tormentors. He never begged for mercy. He never even cried out. Then came the long walk to Calvary, carrying the heavy wooden crossbeam. Longinus had seen strong men collapse under that weight. Jesus, already weakened by the flogging, fell 3 times. But each time he got back up. Each time, he kept moving forward, like nothing could stop him from reaching his destination. By the time they reached the hill called Golgotha, the place of the skull, Longinus was beginning to feel something he hadn't felt in years. Uneasiness. Not fear exactly, but a growing sense that this execution was different, that this prisoner was different, that something unprecedented was about to happen. He had no idea how right he was. At 9 a.m., they nailed Jesus to the cross. Longinus had overseen this procedure hundreds of times. Drive the nails through the wrists, not the palms which would tear, and through the feet. Hoist the cross upright. Post a crime placard. Wait for death. But from the moment Jesus' cross was raised, everything started going wrong. First, there was what Jesus said. Longinus had heard every kind of final words imaginable. Curses, pleas, threats of revenge, declarations of innocence. But Jesus' first words from the cross were unlike anything the Centurion had ever heard. Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Longinus stopped dead in his tracks. Forgive them? Forgive the men who were torturing him to death? Forgive the soldiers who had just driven nails through his limbs? Forgive the crowd that was mocking his agony? In 20 years of military service, Longinus had never heard a dying man pray for his executioners. Never. It was unprecedented, impossible, almost divine. But that was just the beginning. At noon, 6 hours into what should have been a routine execution, the sun disappeared. Not an eclipse, not clouds. The sun simply went out. Darkness fell over the land like a blanket. Unnatural, terrifying, absolute. Longinus had been in battles where the sky was black with smoke. He'd endured sandstorms that blotted out the sun. But this was different. This darkness felt alive, purposeful, angry. The soldiers stopped gambling. The crowd stopped mocking. Even the thieves hanging on either side of Jesus fell silent. The only sound was the wind, howling through the darkness like the voices of the damned. And then the earthquake started. Not one earthquake, multiple earthquakes coming in waves. The ground bucked and rolled beneath their feet like a ship in a storm. Rock split. The stone pavement of Jerusalem cracked. In the temple, the massive curtain that separated the Holy of Holies from the rest of the sanctuary tore in half from top to bottom. But the most terrifying thing was what was happening to Jesus himself. Even as the earth convulsed and the sky went black, Jesus remained conscious, alert, speaking. He comforted one of the thieves hanging beside him. He provided for his mother's care. He quoted scripture. He was orchestrating his own death with a supernatural composure that defied human explanation. Longinus had seen men die badly, screaming, begging, losing control of bodily functions. He'd seen men die well, with dignity, courage, or defiant bravery. But he'd never seen a man die like this. Jesus wasn't just enduring crucifixion. He was commanding it. And then, at 3 p.m., Jesus cried out in a loud voice, "It is finished." In Greek, the word was tetelestai. Longinus knew that word. It was a commercial term used when a debt was paid in full, when a business transaction was completed, when an obligation was satisfied. But what debt was Jesus talking about? What transaction was being completed? What obligation was being satisfied? Longinus was about to find out. It is finished. Those 3 words hit Longinus like a physical blow. Because in that moment, he realized that Jesus hadn't just died. He had chosen to die. The timing, the circumstances, even the suffering, all of it had been under Jesus' control from the beginning. But there was no time to process this revelation, because that's when the supernatural events reached their climax. Jesus had been hanging on the cross for 6 hours. By all medical logic, he should have been unconscious, maybe already dead. Crucifixion victims typically died from asphyxiation, gradually suffocating as their strength gave out and they could no longer push themselves up to breathe. But Jesus was alert, speaking clearly, fully conscious when he chose to release his spirit. And the moment he died, all hell broke loose. The earthquake that followed wasn't like the previous tremors. This one was massive, violent, personal. The ground didn't just shake, it split open. Tombs cracked apart. According to Matthew's Gospel, dead people came out of their graves and walked around Jerusalem. But for Longinus, the most terrifying moment came when he approached Jesus' body to confirm death. It was standard procedure. Make sure the condemned was actually dead before releasing the body for burial. Usually, soldiers would break the legs of crucifixion victims to speed up death, making it impossible for them to push up and breathe. But when Longinus reached Jesus, he could see that death had already come. The body was still, the breathing stopped, the eyes closed. There was no need to break his legs. Still, to be absolutely certain, Longinus took his spear, the same spear he'd carried into dozens of battles, the weapon that had ended dozens of lives, and drove it into Jesus' side, piercing the heart. What happened next changed everything. Blood and water flowed out of the wound. Not just blood, blood and water separated. Any soldier who'd seen battle wounds knew that wasn't normal. When you pierce a dead body, blood doesn't flow freely. It congeals, it clots, doesn't pour out in a steady stream. But this was no ordinary death. As Longinus watched the blood and water flow from Jesus' side, blood that would be remembered as the price of redemption, water that would symbolize the cleansing of sin, something broke inside the hardened centurion's chest. Maybe it was the way Jesus had died. Maybe it was the supernatural events surrounding the crucifixion. Maybe it was the inexplicable sense that he had just witnessed not just an execution, but a cosmic transaction of infinite proportions. Or maybe it was simpler than that. Maybe it was the first time in decades that Longinus had looked into the face of perfect goodness and seen his own reflection in comparison. Whatever the cause, the man who had killed without conscience, tortured without mercy, and hardened his heart against human suffering, suddenly found himself overwhelmed by an emotion he hadn't felt since childhood: conviction. Not guilt over this particular execution. He'd been following orders. But conviction over his entire life, his entire career, his entire identity as a professional killer. And in that moment of crushing self-awareness, with Jesus' blood still dripping from his spear and the earth still trembling beneath his feet, Longinus did something he'd never done before. He fell to his knees. Picture the scene: a Roman centurion, the symbol of imperial power and authority, on his knees in the dirt at the foot of a cross. His spear, still wet with the blood of the man he'd just killed, dropped from his trembling hands. His weathered face, accustomed to showing nothing but stern authority, now contorted with an emotion his fellow soldiers had never seen: awe. And then Longinus spoke, not in the crisp, commanding tone of a military officer giving orders, not in the casual conversation of a soldier discussing the day's work, but in a voice broken by wonder, heavy with realization, thick with the weight of sudden understanding. Truly this man was the Son of God. 7 words. 7 simple words that shattered 2 decades of hardened brutality and announced the birth of faith in the most unlikely heart imaginable. But understand what was happening here. This wasn't religious emotionalism. This wasn't crowd psychology. Longinus was alone, separated from the crowd by his military role, isolated from his men by his rank, and distinguished from the Jewish religious leaders by his Roman citizenship. This was a professional assessment from a trained observer, a man whose job required him to read people accurately, evaluate situations correctly, and report truthfully on what he'd witnessed. And what he'd witnessed had convinced him, beyond any doubt, beyond any possibility of error, that the man he'd just executed was no ordinary human being. Think about what it took for Longinus to make this declaration. As a Roman, he'd been raised to worship the pantheon of Roman gods: Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and ultimately Caesar himself. Acknowledging the divinity of a crucified Jewish criminal was not just religiously revolutionary. It was politically treasonous. As a centurion, his career depended on maintaining the respect of his subordinates and superiors. Roman military culture had no place for sentiment, superstition, or spiritual weakness. For a commanding officer to fall to his knees before a dead prisoner was career suicide. As a pragmatist, he knew that dead men don't inspire faith. In his experience, failed revolutionaries became footnotes in history, not objects of worship. Yet here he was, proclaiming the divinity of a man who had just died the most humiliating death imaginable. But none of those considerations mattered anymore, because in the span of 6 hours, Longinus had witnessed events that transcended human explanation and demanded divine recognition. He'd seen Jesus forgive his executioners while they were executing him. He'd watched him maintain perfect composure while suffering perfect agony. He'd observed him die with such authority and timing that it was clear death was his servant, not his master. He'd experienced supernatural darkness, witnessed impossible earthquakes, and felt the presence of forces beyond human comprehension. And when he'd pierced Jesus' side with his spear, he'd seen blood and water flow in a way that defied medical explanation. But perhaps most powerfully, he'd looked into Jesus' face during those final moments and seen something that his soldiers' training had taught him to recognize: absolute truth. Not the truth of innocence. He'd seen innocent men die before, but the truth of identity, the truth of purpose, the truth of divine mission accomplished. The story of Longinus isn't just ancient history. It's a mirror that reflects profound truths about human nature, divine grace, and the possibility of transformation that are just as relevant today as they were 2,000 years ago. First, it teaches us about the power of recognition. Longinus's life changed the moment he truly saw who Jesus was. Not just intellectually, but spiritually. Not just with his mind, but with his heart. The same recognition is available to you today. The question isn't whether Jesus is who he claimed to be. The evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is whether you're willing to see it, acknowledge it, and respond to it. Second, it teaches us about the reality of forgiveness. If Jesus could forgive the man who literally killed him, there's no sin he can't forgive, no past he can't redeem, no failure he can't overcome. Longinus didn't earn forgiveness by good behavior. He received it while his spear was still wet with Jesus' blood. That same forgiveness is offered to you today, not because you deserve it, but because that's who Jesus is. Third, it teaches us about the possibility of transformation. Longinus didn't just have a religious experience. He became a fundamentally different person. The killer became a life giver. The destroyer became a builder. The hardened soldier became a gentle evangelist. God didn't just forgive who Longinus had been. He transformed him into who he could become. Finally, it teaches us about the cost of testimony. Longinus's transformation cost him his career, his security, and eventually his life. Following Jesus isn't just about receiving forgiveness. It's about being willing to live differently, speak truth, and pay the price that authentic discipleship requires. His name was Longinus. He was a Roman centurion who drove a spear into Jesus' side and ended the earthly life of the Son of God. For years, he had killed without conscience, tortured without mercy, and hardened his heart against human suffering. But what he said at the foot of the cross, truly this man was the Son of God, changed his life forever. And it can change yours too, because the same Jesus who forgave his executioner is ready to forgive you. The same grace that transformed a killer into an evangelist is available to transform your life. The same love that reached down to the man holding the bloody spear is reaching out to you right now. Longinus discovered that it's never too late for redemption, never too late for transformation, never too late to recognize the truth and respond to it. He learned that God's grace is greater than our worst failures. God's love is stronger than our deepest shame, and God's power is sufficient for our complete transformation. The question isn't whether you deserve it. None of us do. The question is whether you'll recognize it, receive it, and be transformed by it. The spear that ended Jesus' earthly life became the instrument of eternal life for the man who wielded it. What instrument of destruction in your life could God transform into an instrument of grace? The Roman soldier who killed Jesus lived to proclaim his divinity. What will you do with the truth about who Jesus really is? If this story has moved your heart and opened your eyes to the reality of God's grace, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to know that no one is beyond redemption. No past is beyond forgiveness. No life is beyond transformation. Comment "forgiven" if you believe that the same grace extended to Longinus is available to you today. And if you've never experienced that forgiveness personally, if you've never recognized Jesus as who he really is, today could be your moment of recognition, just like it was for a Roman centurion 2,000 years ago. See you next time.